You're here again, that means I'm doing it right. That means you're ready to listen. That means we can begin. The summer evening wrapped the home of Jason and Mary Ann Roberts in a soft warmth, like an old blanket pulled from a trunk on a cold day. The two-story suburban cottage, surrounded by neatly trimmed shrubs and flower beds, was aglow with light from every window. Outside, the sounds of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft strains of a jazz standard pouring from speakers in the backyard echoed. It was the homeowner's 15th wedding anniversary, an occasion that brought together friends, family, and neighbors eager to share in the joy of the day. Inside, the house was filled with the aromas of freshly baked bread, roasted meats, and vanilla custard from the desserts Mary Ann had prepared that morning. The living room, decorated with garlands of white and gold balloons, looked like a scene from a cozy family movie. A long table covered with a white tablecloth was laden with treats, and people bustled around it, exchanging stories and smiles. Children ran between the adults, now and then stealing canapés or candies from the plates until they were pulled back by laughing parents. Jason, a tall man with a touch of gray in his dark hair, stood at the bar in the corner of the living room, pouring wine into glasses. His navy blue jacket was slightly unbuttoned, and his smile, though genuine, seemed a little strained. He kept glancing at Mary Ann, who flitted among the guests, adjusting flower arrangements and hugging old friends. Her sea-green dress flowed over her figure, accentuating a grace that the years seemed to have honed. But there was a subtle shadow in her movements, in the way she looked away when Jason looked at her too long, something none of the guests noticed, too caught up in the hustle and bustle of the party. "Jason, old man, here's to you," Jason's best friend Paul exclaimed, raising his glass of red wine. His loud voice cut through the din of conversation, and several heads turned in his direction. Paul, with his broad shoulders, thick beard, and infectious laugh, always had a way of getting people's attention. 15 years, for fuck's sake. That's like being in prison, only with good food and no bars. He winked, and the crowd burst into laughter. Jason smiled, but his eyes lingered for a moment on Mary Ann, who stood at the refreshment table, adjusting a plate of fruit. She didn't turn around, though she'd clearly heard the joke. "Thank you, Paul," Jason said, raising his glass. "But you know, with a woman like Mary Ann, 15 years have flown by in a flash." His voice was warm, but there was a note in it that only those who knew him well could detect. Maybe it was weariness. Maybe it was something else. Mary Ann finally looked up, a smile tugging at her lips, but she quickly turned away, starting a conversation with her sister, Kate, who had just arrived with a glass of champagne. Kate, 5 years younger, was the polar opposite of Mary Ann, loud, with bright red hair and a habit of saying whatever came into her head. "Mary, you're a queen today," Kate exclaimed, hugging her sister. "This dress, this house, this cake. My God, have you ever slept for the last 3 days?" Mary Ann laughed, but it was a little forced. "Oh, Kate, you're exaggerating. I just wanted everything to be perfect. It's a special day." "Special? That's quite a feat. 15 years with Jason is no joke." Kate winked, but then lowered her voice, leaning closer. "Listen, are you okay? You look, I don't know, a little tense." Mary Ann froze for a split second, then waved it off. "I'm fine, Kate. I'm just tired. Organizing a party isn't like baking a pie." Kate looked at her sister with a hint of doubt, but didn't press the issue. Instead, she grabbed another canapé and wandered off to join a group of friends discussing the latest gossip about the neighbors. Meanwhile, Jason had moved away from the bar and toward a group of colleagues who had settled on couches in the corner. Among them was Mark, his business partner, a man in his 40s with a sharp gaze and a habit of speaking as if every word was worth money. "Jason, this is a great party," Mark said, sipping his whiskey. "Mary Ann has outdone herself. But tell me honestly, how do you cope with being married for so many years? I'm starting to think that being single isn't such a bad idea after all, with Lisa in my 7th year." The guests around him laughed, but Jason just shrugged. "It's all about compromise, Mark, and remembering why it all started." He paused, looking down at the glass in his hand. although, sometimes it's difficult. Mark raised an eyebrow, but before he could say anything, his phone began to ring. Jason walked over to the window, looking out at the backyard, where children were playing tag under the streetlights. His gaze slid back to Mary Ann, who was now talking to an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Graham. She was smiling and nodding, but her fingers were fiddling nervously with the edge of the tablecloth. As the evening wore on, the warm atmosphere only grew more intense. Someone turned on some livelier music, and several couples began dancing in the living room, laughing and bumping into each other. Paul, now slightly tipsy, attempted to organize a toast to "Love Conquers All," but his speech quickly devolved into a rambling stream of jokes, prompting another round of laughter. Mary Ann took the opportunity to slip into the kitchen to make sure everything was ready to serve the cake. She closed the door behind her and leaned against the counter for a moment, taking a deep breath. The silence of the kitchen was a breath of fresh air after the noise of the living room. She looked at her reflection in the glass cabinet door, a face that still looked young, but with fine lines around the eyes that betrayed age and care. She smoothed her hair and tried to smile, but it came out forced. The door creaked and Jason walked into the kitchen. He paused at the threshold, holding an empty snack tray. Their eyes met, and for a second there was silence in the air, not the kind that calms, but the kind that makes your heart beat a little faster. "The guests are asking about the cake," he said, his voice soft but with a hint of caution. "Is everything ready?" Mary Ann nodded, turning to the sink to rinse her hands. "Yeah, I'll get it out right now. Just give me a minute, okay?" Jason took a step forward, but stopped. "Mary, are you sure everything's okay? You've been kind of distant all evening." She turned, her eyes flashing for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "I'm just tired, Jason. That's all. Throwing a party like this is no joke." He nodded, but his eyes said he didn't quite believe it. "Okay, if anything happens, you know I'm always here." "I know," she answered quietly, almost in a whisper. But her voice didn't have the warmth it had before, many years ago, when they could talk for hours without noticing the time. Jason was about to add something, but at that moment Kate burst into the kitchen with an empty glass in her hand. "Mary, cake! People are ready to bite the walls with impatience." She froze, noticing the tense faces of her sister and brother-in-law. "Oh, am I interrupting?" "No, it's okay," Mary Ann quickly replied, forcing a smile. "Come on, it's time to bring out the cake." She brushed past Jason, heading for the refrigerator where a three-tiered masterpiece, decorated with cream roses and the words 15 years written in gold, waited. Jason stood there for a second, watching her go, and then followed her, picking up the tray of glasses. Applause greeted them in the living room. The cake, brought out to a blare of fanfare from the speakers, was the highlight of the evening. Guests surrounded the table, shouting congratulations, and children jumped up and down, trying to see if they could get a piece of the cream rose. Mary Ann and Jason stood next to each other, holding the knife together as required by the ritual. Their hands touched, and for a moment their eyes met again. Mary Ann's smile was perfect, rehearsed, but her eyes were cold. Jason squeezed her hand a little tighter, as if trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. "To love," someone from the crowd shouted, and the glasses clinked again. But behind this ringing, behind the laughter and applause, no one noticed how Mary Ann's fingers trembled, and Jason looked away, hiding a shadow of doubt in it. The warm summer evening was fading into night, and the Roberts house, surrounded by neat flower beds and twinkling lanterns, was buzzing with voices and music like a living organism. Light from the windows poured onto the lawn, reflecting in the glasses of guests who were still in no hurry to leave. In the living room, where the birthday cake had just been cut, an atmosphere of relaxed joy reigned. Someone was dancing to light retro pop, someone was arguing about politics at the bar, and children, tired of playing, settled on the sofas with tablets, occasionally giggling at cartoons. The aromas of roast meat, fresh fruit, and vanilla cream mingled with the scent of jasmine, which wafted from the backyard, where some guests had already moved to smoke or just breathe in the cool night air. Jason stood by the fireplace, his fingers wrapped around a heavy crystal tumbler of whiskey. He had long since removed his jacket, hanging it over the back of a chair, and he had loosened his tie, allowing himself to appear slightly less formal. His dark, graying hair was a little tousled, but he still retained the quiet confidence that made him the center of attention in any room. His eyes, however, were alert and slightly narrowed, betraying tension. He was watching Mary Ann, who stood at the dessert table, helping an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Graham, select a slice of cake. Mary Ann was in her elemental hostess mode, her sea-green dress flowing around her figure to accentuate her grace, and her smile, honed by years of socializing, seemed flawless. But Jason knew her too well not to notice the way her fingers trembled slightly as she passed a plate, the way her gaze avoided him when he looked too long. In the corner of the living room, a noisy group of Jason's colleagues from the law firm had gathered at the bar. Among them was Bradley Crowe, a junior partner whose penchant for drinking and loud talk was legendary. Bradley, his hair disheveled and his face flushed from wine, waved his glass like a conductor's baton as he told yet another story. His voice, slightly slurred but full of enthusiasm, cut through the music, drawing the attention of those around him. "So I tell him," Bradley leaned toward Mark, his interlocutor, almost spilling wine on his shirt. "Tom, if you think I'm going to work overtime for your report, you've clearly overestimated my loyalty." He burst out laughing, and several people around him joined in, although it was obvious that half of them weren't listening to the details. Mark, Jason's business partner, rolled his eyes, but the corners of his lips twitched into a smile. "Bradley, are you ever going to shut up? Or do you need more wine to completely knock yourself out?" "Wine." Bradley clasped his hand to his chest dramatically, as if he'd been mortally insulted. "Mark, I'm a sensitive soul. Wine is my way of communicating with the world. And by the way," he lowered his voice, but not enough to be overheard by those nearby, "I know some gossip that would make you all run for the popcorn." The crowd around him began to buzz, egging him on. Mary Ann's sister, Kate, who had just come to the bar for another glass of champagne, immediately joined in, her red hair flashing in the chandelier light and her eyes dancing with mischief. "Oh, Bradley, don't keep me in suspense," she exclaimed, winking. "Tell me something juicy. I'm sure your office is full of secrets." Bradley grinned, clearly enjoying the attention. He took a long sip of wine, wiped his lips with the back of his hand, and leaned closer to Kate, though his voice could still be heard halfway across the room. "Well, if you insist," he began, looking around at the assembled group like a showman about to give a punchline. "You know our boss, Tom Hartman. He's a tough guy, but they say he's not as saintly as he seems." He paused, savoring the moment, and added, lowering his voice to a stage whisper, "They say he's having an affair, and with none other than our dear Mary Ann." There was a moment of silence in the room, not complete silence, but the kind where the music and laughter suddenly became muted, as if someone had turned down the volume. A few people glanced at each other, a few giggled nervously, and Kate, still holding her glass, froze, her smile slowly fading. "Bradley, you're drunk," Mark said sharply, trying to turn it into a joke. "Watch your language, or tomorrow you'll be explaining to Tom why you're telling such stories." But Bradley, warmed by the alcohol and the attention, wasn't about to stop. He waved his hand, nearly knocking over the bottle on the counter. "Stories? Ha, I saw them whispering in his office last week." The door was ajar, and Mary Ann, he took another sip, looked like she'd just stepped out of a spa, and Tom was all. He put on a comically serious face. "Oh, Mary Ann, you're irreplaceable." His parody drew chuckles from a couple of the guests, but the tension in the air was growing. Jason, standing by the fireplace, froze. His fingers gripped his glass so tightly his knuckles were white. He turned his head slowly toward Bradley, his gaze sharp as a blade. Mary Ann, who was carrying another piece of cake to Mrs. Graham, stopped mid-step. Her face was pale, but she quickly looked down, focusing on her plate as if she hadn't heard. Kate, unable to keep silent, stepped towards Bradley, her voice sharpening, although she tried to keep a light tone. Bradley, are you serious? It's my sister's anniversary, and you're making up things like this. Maybe it's time for you to switch to water. Water? Bradley laughed, but there was a nervous edge to his laugh. Kate, I'm not making this up. I'm just telling you what I saw. And I'm not the only one, by the way. People have been whispering about it around the office for a month now. That's enough, Bradley. Mark cut him off, no longer smiling. He put his hand on his colleague's shoulder, as if trying to physically stop the flow of words. You've had too much. Come on, get some air. But Bradley waved it off, his eyes shining with drink and adrenaline. Oh, come on, why are you all so serious? It's just gossip. Or do you think Jason doesn't know? He turned to Jason, who was still standing by the fireplace, and his voice grew louder. Jason, man, you know, right? You know about Tom and Mary Ann. Everyone knows she's in his office almost every day. The crowd gasped, and some tried to laugh, but it came out awkwardly. Mary Ann set her plate down slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she were afraid to do anything unnecessary. She looked up, and her gaze met Jason's. For a second, time seemed to stand still. Her eyes were a mixture of fear, anger, and something else that was impossible to discern. Jason looked at her as if he were trying to find an answer to a question he didn't dare ask. Bradley, he said finally, his voice quiet but steely, I think it's time you shut up. Bradley opened his mouth to protest, but Mark had already grabbed him by the elbow and was dragging him toward the backyard. Show's over, he muttered, throwing an apologetic glance at Jason. I'll take him away. But the party didn't stop. The guests, as if by unspoken agreement, decided to ignore the awkward moment. Someone turned up the music, and a couple of people went back to dancing. Others began to discuss something neutral, a new movie, the weather, plans for the weekend. But there was still a tension in the air, like smoke from smoldering coals that no one noticed, but everyone felt. Mary Ann took advantage of the commotion to slip into the kitchen, closing the door behind her. The silence was a relief from the hubbub of the living room. She leaned against the counter, took a deep breath, and looked at her reflection in the glass cabinet door. Her face, still beautiful, but with fine lines around her eyes, looked tired. She smoothed her hair and tried to smile, but it was forced. Bradley's words, drunken and ridiculous, echoed in her head, and she felt a storm brewing inside her, a mixture of shame, anger, and fear. The door creaked and Jason walked into the kitchen. He paused at the threshold, holding an empty snack tray. Their eyes met, and for a moment there was silence in the air, not the kind that soothes, but the kind that makes your heart beat faster. Mary, he began, his voice soft but careful. We need to talk. She turned back to the sink, beginning to rinse her hands, though they were clean. Not now, Jason. Please, we have company. The guests can wait, he said, stepping forward. What was that? What Bradley said. Mary Ann turned sharply, her eyes flashing. That was drunken nonsense, Jason. You don't believe that crap, do you? He looked at her, his gaze hard, as if he were trying to peer into her soul. I want to believe you, Mary, but you've been different all evening, and I can't help but think there's something to his words. She pressed her lips together, her fingers gripping the edge of the tabletop. Are you serious? You think I'm capable of this, after 15 years? I don't know what to think, he answered honestly, his voice shaking. You barely talk to me. You avoid me. And now this. He trailed off, as if afraid to continue. Mary Ann shook her head, her eyes shining but holding back tears. I'm tired, Jason. I'm tired of all this, of the parties, of your coworkers, of this house, of... She trailed off, as if she'd said more than she'd intended. Just leave me alone, just for today. Jason was about to answer, but at that moment Kate burst into the kitchen, her red hair flying and an empty glass in her hands. Mary, people are asking for more coffee, and I don't know where you hide your coffee machine. She froze, noticing the tense faces of her sister and brother-in-law. Oh, am I at the wrong time again? Mary Ann quickly composed herself, forcing a smile. No, it's okay. I'll do it now. She walked past Jason, brushing her shoulder against his, and began fiddling with the coffee machine as if nothing had happened. Jason stood there for a moment, watching her go, then walked back into the living room, where the party was still going on. The guests seemed to have forgotten Bradley's outburst, but he couldn't get the words out of his head. He joined a group of colleagues discussing the recent trial, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing toward the kitchen, where Mary Ann was making coffee, her movements quick and abrupt, as if she were taking out her anger on the coffee machine. Meanwhile, Kate remained in the kitchen, watching her sister carefully. She came closer, lowering her voice. "Mary, what's going on? And don't tell me everything's fine. I saw the way you looked at Jason, and the way he looked at you." Mary Ann didn't answer right away, concentrating on getting the filter into the coffee machine correctly. "Kate, please. It's none of your business." "Not mine." Kate narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. "You're my sister, and I can see you're on edge. That idiot Bradley was talking nonsense, but there's something else, right? Something between you and Jason." Mary Ann finally turned, her eyes full of emotion she was trying to contain. "Kate, I don't want to talk about this. Not now. Not here. We have company, and I just want this evening to end without another scandal." Kate wanted to argue, but something in her sister's voice made her shut up. She just nodded and hugged Mary Ann, feeling her tremble slightly. "Okay, but I'm here if anything happens." In the living room, the party was picking up steam. Someone had turned on karaoke, and a couple of the guests, already quite drunk, began singing an old Sinatra song, off-key on every word. Others were laughing, encouraging them, and a few were even trying to dance along to their impromptu performance. But Jason couldn't join in. He stood by the window, looking out into the backyard, where Mark was still trying to talk Bradley out of the way. The drunk coworker's words played in his head like a broken record, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a grain of truth in them, or at least something he suspected, but was afraid to admit. Mary Ann returned to the living room with a tray of coffee, her smile perfect but her eyes cold. She poured the drinks, exchanging pleasantries with her guests, but every gesture seemed rehearsed, like a part in a play. Jason watched her, feeling the distance between them grow with each passing minute. He wanted to go over, take her hand, lead her aside and talk, but something stopped him, perhaps fear of hearing the truth, or perhaps exhaustion from trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The evening wore on, and the guests showed no signs of leaving. Someone suggested a game of charades, and soon the living room was filled with laughter and shouts as people tried to guess what each participant was impersonating. Kate, trying to lighten the mood, pulled Mary Ann into the game, and she reluctantly agreed. She impersonated a pirate, waving an imaginary sword, and the guests laughed, encouraging her. But Jason noticed that her laughter was empty, and her eyes were distant. He walked over to the bar where Mark, back from the backyard, was pouring himself another whiskey. "Bradley gone?" Jason asked, trying to sound neutral. Mark nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, I called him a cab. He was out cold. Jason, I'm sorry about that. He had too much to drink, and he didn't know what he was saying." Jason nodded, but his gaze was fixed on Mary Ann, who was now laughing at someone else's attempt at an elephant. "Is it true?" he asked quietly, almost a whisper. "What he said about Mary Ann and Tom?" Mark froze, his hand holding the bottle of whiskey in midair. "Jason, it's gossip. You know how it is in the office. Someone saw something, someone made something up. Don't worry about it." But Jason didn't answer. He finished his whiskey and set the glass down on the bar, feeling a storm building inside him. He wanted to believe Mark, he wanted to believe Mary Ann, but something about her demeanor, her distance, her silence, made him doubt it. He glanced at his watch. It was past midnight, but the guests, engrossed in charades and karaoke, were not leaving. Mary Ann, having finished her turn in the game, went to the refreshment table to refill the plates. Kate followed, unable to leave her sister alone. "Mary, you're doing well," she said, lowering her voice. "But I can see you're having a hard time. Would you like me to help disperse the crowd? It's late. Mary Ann shook her head, her smile tired but determined. No, Kate, let them have fun. This is our day, and I don't want it to end on this note. Kate looked at her doubtfully, but didn't argue. She went back to her game, leaving Mary Ann alone. She stood at the table, looking at the empty glasses, and suddenly felt her eyes filling with tears. She quickly turned away, pretending to straighten the tablecloth, but the tears were still rolling down her cheeks. She wiped them with the back of her hand, hoping no one noticed. But Jason had noticed. He stood back, watching her, and his heart sank. He wanted to go over, to hug her, to tell her it would be okay, but Bradley's words, her distance, her tears, they all jumbled together in his head, forming a knot of doubt and pain. He turned and walked out into the backyard, where the night was cool and still, and the stars seemed so far away that their light barely reached the ground. Mary Ann felt her heart sink as he left. She knew she should say something, explain, but the words stuck in her throat. She looked at the guests, who were still enjoying themselves, and suddenly felt like a stranger in her own home. She clenched her fists, trying to pull herself together, and returned to her role as hostess. But every step she took was heavy, as if she were carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. As the party went on, no one but Kate, Mark, and a few attentive guests noticed that a rift, subtle but deep, was beginning to grow between Jason and Mary Ann. The music played and the glasses clinked, but beneath the noise was a silence that was louder than any words. The warm July night enveloped the Roberts house like soft velvet, but inside, amid the hum of voices and rhythmic music, the air seemed electric. The living room, decorated with garlands and flowers, was still bustling with life. Someone was dancing to catchy retro pop, someone was arguing about politics at the bar, and someone, already quite tipsy, was trying to sing karaoke, losing the tune and causing bursts of laughter. The children, tired from running, dozed on the sofas or played games on tablets, and the adults, warmed by wine, whiskey, and champagne, were becoming louder and more frank. The backyard, illuminated by lanterns, beckoned to those who wanted to breathe fresh air or smoke a cigarette, but most of the guests were still crowded inside, not wanting to end this festive evening. Jason stood by the fireplace, his fingers tightly wrapped around his glass of whiskey, though he had barely taken a sip. His dark, graying hair was slightly disheveled, his tie long since loosened, and his shirt unbuttoned to the top button, giving him the look of a man trying to relax but unable to. His gaze kept drifting to Mary Ann, who flitted among the guests, adjusting plates of appetizers or exchanging pleasantries. Her sea-green dress flowed around her, accentuating her grace, but Jason noticed details that escaped others. The slight tremor in her fingers as she passed the glass, or the way she avoided his gaze, as if afraid he might read something in her eyes. The words of Bradley, his drunk coworker, still rang in his ears like a persistent melody he couldn't shake. They say Tom is having an affair with Mary Ann. Jason had dismissed it as drunken chatter at first. Bradley had always been a master of big pronouncements, especially after his third drink. But something in his tone, the confident way he rattled off details, had gotten under Jason's skin. He tried to convince himself it was just gossip, office chatter, but the doubt was already lodged in his mind like a tiny shard of glass. Bradley, still standing at the bar, continued to entertain the crowd. His face, flushed from the wine, was glistening with sweat, and his disheveled hair gave him the appearance of a slightly mad preacher. He waved his glass as he told yet another story, and his voice, loud and slurring, rose above the music. So I tell him. Bradley leaned toward Paul, his best listener, nearly spilling wine on his shirt. Tom, if you think I'm going to lick your ass for a promotion, you're fucking wrong. He burst out laughing, and several people around him laughed, though it was clear that half of them were just playing along. Paul, a broad-shouldered, bearded man with an infectious laugh, clapped Bradley on the back. Brad, you're incredible, but dude, slow down, or Tom's going to fire you tomorrow for telling stories like that. Fire me? Bradley's eyes widened dramatically, pressing his hand to his chest. I'm his gold mine. Without me, this office will fall apart. And by the way, he lowered his voice, but it was still audible halfway across the room. I know such secrets that Tom himself would double my salary if only I would keep quiet. Mary Ann's sister, Kate, who was standing nearby with a glass of champagne, immediately joined in the conversation, her red hair flashing in the chandelier light and her eyes dancing with mischief. "Bradley, don't drag it out," she exclaimed, winking. "Spill your secrets. I'm sure there's more gossip in that office of yours than in a convent." Bradley grinned, clearly enjoying the attention. He took a long sip of wine, wiped his lips with the back of his hand, and leaned closer to Kate. "Well, if you ask me, remember what I said about Tom and Mary Ann? It wasn't just gossip, baby. I saw them whispering in his office. The door was ajar, and He paused, raising his eyebrows meaningfully. She looked like she'd just gotten a massage. And Tom, he was all, "Mary Ann, you're a godsend." His parody drew chuckles from a couple of the guests, but the tension in the air was growing. Jason, standing by the fireplace, felt his blood boil. He set his glass down on the mantelpiece, so abruptly that the whiskey sloshed over the edge. He didn't want to believe Bradley, but his words, drunk and brazen, hit home. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and headed for the bar, where Bradley was still singing like a nightingale. "Bradley," Jason said, his voice low but firm as a hammer blow. "Let's go talk." Bradley turned, his eyes slightly clouded with alcohol, but still grinning. "Oh, Jason, man, come join us. I was just telling you how." Outside, Jason interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. He nodded toward the backyard, where the lights were flickering, and gave Bradley a gentle nudge on the shoulder, guiding him toward the door. The guests around them fell silent, exchanging glances. Kate, noticing Jason's tense face, tried to intervene. "Jason, he's just drunk. There's no need." "I'll handle it, Kate," he snapped, not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on Bradley, who stumbled after him. The backyard was cool, the air smelling of jasmine and freshly cut grass. The lanterns cast soft shadows on the wooden porch, where wicker chairs and a table with empty glasses were set. Jason closed the glass door behind him, cutting off the noise of the party, and turned to Bradley, who was leaning against the railing, still holding his glass. "What the fuck are you talking about?" Jason asked, his voice quiet but threatening. "Do you realize what you just said about my wife?" Bradley chuckled, his grin widening. "Oh, come on, Jason, don't get so worked up. It's just talk. Everyone in the office knows Tom has a thing for her. And well, she's not stupid. She knows how to suck up to the boss to get things done." Jason stepped closer, his fists clenching. "Repeat what you said." Bradley, oblivious to the danger, continued, his tongue slurring, but he was too drunk to stop. "Come on, man. I'm not saying she's actually having sex with him. Although, word around the office is she's in his office like every day. And for good reason, if you know what I mean." He winked, as if it were a joke, and took another sip of wine. "Tom, he's not blind. And Mary Ann, well, she's a firecracker, Who wouldn't want to?" Jason grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, so hard Bradley almost dropped his glass. "Watch your mouth, Bradley," he growled, his face inches from his colleagues. "One more word, and you'll regret opening your mouth." Bradley, finally sensing the gravity of the situation, raised his hands in an attempt to laugh it off. Hey, dude, relax. It's just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, everyone knows she's into Tom. I saw her coming out of his office, all glowing. And he was all." Bradley tried to imitate Tom, but his voice broke when he saw Jason's eyes darken. "You're lying," Jason said, but his voice was shaking. He let go of Bradley, taking a step back, but his fists were still clenched. "You're drunk and talking nonsense. But if I find out any of this is true—" "Oh, come on," Bradley muttered, straightening his shirt. "It's just rumors. Office chatter. Forget it." But Jason wasn't listening anymore. He turned and walked back into the house, his blood pounding in his temples. Bradley's words, drunken and rough, were biting into his mind like rusty nails. He wanted to believe it was a lie, but the details, shiny, every day, on a short leg, sounded too concrete to be made up. When he returned to the living room, the party was in full swing. Someone had put on a new song, and a group of guests, including Kate, were dancing, laughing, and bumping into each other. But Jason noticed that some of the guests were giving him odd looks, quick, furtive glances, as if they were afraid he would notice. Mrs. Graham, an elderly neighbor, gave him a sympathetic look before turning away. One of his co-workers, Steve, looked away when Jason caught his eye. Even Paul, usually loud and easygoing, seemed quieter than usual as Jason passed. Mary Ann stood at the dessert table, talking to her childhood friend, Lisa. Her smile was perfect, but Jason noticed her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of the tablecloth. He wanted to go over, take her hand, pull her aside, demand an explanation, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the fear of hearing the truth. Maybe it was the fear of making a scene in front of everyone. Kate, noticing his return, broke away from her dance and walked up to him, her face serious. "Jason, what happened? Are you okay?" He shook his head, trying to look calmer than he felt. "Just talking to Bradley. He's drunk and talking nonsense." Kate narrowed her eyes, her voice growing quieter. "What did he say? About Mary?" Jason's jaw clenched, his gaze sliding to his wife. "Same as before, that she's with Tom, that he saw them together, that the office is talking about it." Kate gasped, her eyes widening. "That's crazy, Jason. You don't believe him, do you? Bradley's an idiot, especially when he's drunk. He always makes things up." "I know," Jason said, but his voice was unsure. But he sounded so confident, and Mary, she's been different lately, withdrawn. Kate put her hand on his shoulder, her voice softening. "Jason, listen. Mary loves you. I've known her all my life. She wouldn't do something like this. Maybe she's just tired. Organizing this party, work, the kids, it's all taking its toll on her." Jason nodded, but his gaze found Mary Ann again. She was laughing at something Lisa had said, but her laughter was hollow, like the sound of broken glass. He wanted to believe Kate, he wanted to believe Mary Ann, but doubt had already settled in his heart like a dark shadow. Back in the living room, Bradley was once again the center of attention. He seemed unaware of the damage he had done and continued to chatter, this time about some other office gossip. But the guests who had heard his previous revelations were wary. Some whispered among themselves, glancing from Jason to Mary Ann. Others tried hard to pretend nothing had happened, laughing loudly or singing along to karaoke. Mary Ann, feeling the tension, went into the kitchen to get more coffee. The silence of the kitchen was a breath of fresh air after the hubbub of the living room. She leaned against the counter, closed her eyes, and tried to calm her breathing. Bradley's words, his brazen tone, his drunken confidence, all hit her like a hammer. She knew it was a lie, but she also knew that rumors, even the most ridiculous ones, had a way of growing like weeds. And she felt the glances of her guests, their whispers, their awkward smiles, pressing down on her like stones. The door creaked and Kate walked into the kitchen. She closed the door behind her and looked at her sister with concern. "Mary, are you okay? I saw you leave. And Jason, he looks like he's ready to kill someone." Mary Ann opened her eyes, her lips trembling. "I'm fine, Kate. Just tired. And that idiot Bradley." "He's an asshole," Kate interrupted, her voice full of anger. "How dare he say that? And in front of everyone. Do you want me to talk to him? Or Jason?" "No," Mary Ann said sharply, her voice firmer than she'd expected. "Don't. It'll only make things worse. Just give me a minute, okay?" Kate nodded, but her eyes were full of doubt. "Mary, if something's wrong, you can tell me. You know that." Mary Ann forced a smile, but it came out forced. "I know. Thanks, Kate. Just, let's get back to the guests." They walked back out into the living room, where the party was still going on despite the late hour. The guests were dancing, singing, laughing, But Jason could feel their glances, their whispers, their awkward pauses following him like shadows. He was standing at the bar, pouring himself another whiskey, when Paul came up to him. "Hey, man," Paul began, his voice cautious. "Never mind what Bradley said. He always talks like that, especially when he's over it." Jason nodded, but his gaze was fixed on Mary Ann, who was now helping Lisa choose a dessert. "I know, Paul, but did you hear anything at the office about her and Tom?" Paul hesitated, his expression becoming serious. "There are rumors, Jason, but you know how it is. Someone saw something, someone made something up. Don't worry about it." But Jason couldn't help but think. He looked at Mary Ann, at her perfect smile, at her graceful movements, and he felt something inside him crumble. He wanted to go to her, take her hand, lead her away and ask, but fear of the truth, fear of lies held him in place. The party went on, and the guests, carried away by the music and alcohol, seemed to forget about the awkward moment. But Jason could not forget. He stood by the window, looking at the stars, and felt how his world, so familiar and reliable, began to crack at the seams. Night had settled over the Roberts' home, but inside, where the party for their 15th wedding anniversary was still in full swing, the atmosphere was far from tranquil. The living room, decorated with gold garlands and floral arrangements, pulsed with energy. Upbeat music, alternating retro pop with more modern tunes, set the tone as guests danced, laughed, and raised glasses. The aromas of grilled meat, fresh fruit, and vanilla frosting from the birthday cake mingled with the faint smell of cigarettes wafting from the backyard, where a few people had retreated to talk under the stars. Children, exhausted from playing, dozed on the couches or played on their phones, while the adults, fueled by alcohol, grew louder, their voices merging into a hum that seemed capable of drowning out even the summer wind outside. Jason stood by the window, looking out at the flickering lights in the backyard. His glass of whiskey was nearly empty, but he was in no hurry to refill it. His dark hair, slightly streaked with gray, was tousled, and his shirt, unbuttoned to the top button, gave him the appearance of a man who wanted to appear relaxed, but was tense inside. The words of Bradley, his drunk coworker, still echoed in his head like a broken record. "They say Tom is having an affair with Mary Ann." He tried to brush it off, to chalk it up to the alcohol and Bradley's bad temper, but after their conversation in the backyard, where Bradley had spilled even more details about how Mary Ann glowed after meetings with Tom, how she was in his office, almost every day doubts began to grow like dark clouds before a storm. Mary Ann, meanwhile, continued to play the role of the perfect hostess. Her sea-green dress flowed across her figure, accentuating her grace, and her smile, honed by years of social events, seemed flawless. She moved from one group of guests to the next, offering coffee, straightening the tablecloth, or exchanging jokes with her friends. But Jason noticed things that eluded others, the slight tremor in her fingers as she held a tray, or the way her eyes went blank when she thought no one was looking. He wanted to approach, to talk, but after their brief exchange in the kitchen, where she cut off his attempt to discuss Bradley's words, he felt her slipping away not physically, but as if an invisible wall had grown between them. The party continued despite the late hour. The guests, engrossed in the music, dancing, and drinking, showed no signs of leaving. Someone turned on karaoke, and a group of Jason's coworkers, already well into their drinks, attempted to sing an old hit, missing the tune and causing peals of laughter. Others played charades, their shouts and laughter echoing around the living room, while others retreated to the bar, where they discussed everything from politics to gossip about the neighbors. But Jason sensed that the atmosphere had changed. Since Bradley's outburst, when he had loudly accused Mary Ann of having an affair with their boss, Tom Hartman, guests had begun to cast strange glances at Jason, quick, furtive glances, as if afraid he would notice. Some, like Mrs. Graham, an elderly neighbor, looked sympathetic, others curious, and some, like Steve, his coworker, looked away, as if afraid to meet his gaze. Jason couldn't stand by any longer. He could feel the doubts eating away at him, and he decided it was time to get to the bottom of it. He didn't want to believe Bradley, but his words, backed up by drunken confidence and detail, were unsettling. Jason decided to start with the one who had always been honest with him, his best friend, Zach. Zach, tall and thin, with a shock of blonde hair and a habit of saying whatever he thought, was standing at the bar, sipping a beer and chatting with a couple of mutual friends. His laughter, loud and hearty, echoed around the room, but he tensed slightly as he noticed Jason approaching. "Zach," Jason said, stepping closer and nodding toward the backyard. "Let's go have a smoke." Zach raised an eyebrow, knowing Jason only smoked when he was under a lot of stress. "Smoke? Really?" he chuckled, but seeing the look on his friend's face, he nodded. "Okay, let's go." They went out onto the veranda, where the night air was cool and the scent of jasmine mingled with the smoke from the cigarettes the other guests were smoking. Jason pulled the pack out of his pocket, though it was almost untouched, and offered Zach a cigarette. Zach shook his head, preferring his beer. "What's wrong, Jay?" Zach asked, leaning against the railing. His voice was light, but his eyes were wary. "You look like you're ready to punch through walls." Jason lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and looked up at the stars twinkling above the trees. "Did you hear what Bradley said about Mary Ann and Tom?" Zach winced, his fingers tightening around the beer bottle. "Yeah, I heard that. Dude had too much to drink and was talking nonsense. You know Bradley, he likes to be the center of attention, especially when he's drunk." "Maybe so," Jason said, his voice quiet but tight. But he sounded so sure of himself. About her being in Tom's office, whispering. Said the office had been talking about it for a month. He paused, looking at Zach. "Have you heard anything?" Zach looked away, his expression serious. He took a sip of beer, clearly stalling. "Jay, you know how it is. The office is like a village. Someone saw something, someone figured something out, and then everyone's whispering." "So you heard," Jason said, his voice sharpening. "What?" Zach sighed, scratching the back of his head. "Look, I didn't want to tell you anything because it was all bullshit. But, yeah, there were rumors going around the office. Nothing concrete, just people noticed Mary Ann was stopping by Tom's place a lot. Sometimes they'd stay late after work. Someone saw her coming out of his office, all happy. You know, like she'd heard good news, and people started speculating." Jason felt his heart tighten. He took another drag, the smoke burning his throat. "Pleased," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "What else do they say?" Zach hesitated, his gaze darting toward the door, as if he hoped someone would interrupt. "Jay, that's nonsense. Just gossip. You know Mary Ann. She wouldn't." "What else do they say?" Jason interrupted, his voice hard as steel. Zach sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Okay, they say Tom has a thing for her, that he always praises her, gives her the best projects. Someone saw him giving her a ride home a couple times when her car was in for repairs. And, well, you know, people like to embellish things. Someone said they were close. But none of that is proven, Jay. Just talk." Jason was silent, staring at the cigarette smoldering between his fingers. He felt something crumbling inside him, not all at once, but slowly, like a wall being pulled out one brick at a time. He wanted to believe it was a lie, that Zach was right, and that this was all just office gossip. But Zach's words, his reluctant admission, his evasive look, all of it just added fuel to the fire. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jason asked, his voice quiet but hurt. "You're my best friend, Zach. You should have told me." Zach raised his hands defensively. "Because I didn't believe it, and I still don't. Mary Ann loves you, Jay. I didn't want to bring that up so you wouldn't get worked up. You know how it is. Somebody blurts something out, and it just goes on and on." Jason nodded, but his gaze was cold. He stubbed his cigarette out on the railing and turned toward the house. "Thank you for your honesty," he said, but there was no warmth in his voice. Zach was about to say something, but Jason had already walked back into the living room, where the party was in full swing. The guests were dancing, singing, laughing, but he could feel their eyes following him, like whispers he couldn't quite make out but could feel on his skin. He saw Mary Ann's friend Lisa glance at him with mild sympathy before turning away. Steve, his co-worker, looked away as Jason passed. Even Mrs. Graham, who was always easygoing and chatty, fell silent as he approached, quickly changing the subject to discuss the weather. Jason decided to check on one more person, Mark, his business partner. Mark was standing at the bar, sipping whiskey and chatting with a couple of colleagues. His sharp eyes and reserved manner of speaking always made him a reliable conversationalist, but now Jason noticed that he was avoiding Jason's gaze. "Mark, can I talk to you for a minute?" Jason asked, coming closer. Mark nodded, setting his glass on the counter. "Sure, Jay. What is it?" They retreated to a corner of the living room where the noise was a little quieter. Jason crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze fixed on Mark. "You heard what Bradley said about Mary Ann and Tom." Mark winced, his fingers drumming on the edge of the counter. "Yeah, I heard. He was drunk, Jay. Never mind." "I've heard that before," Jason said, his voice sharpening. "But I want to know what the office is saying. Zach said the rumors have been going around for a month. Do you know anything?" Mark sighed, his gaze flicking to Mary Ann, who was standing by the dessert table, talking to Kate. "Look, Jay, I don't like gossip. But, yeah, people say things. Nothing specific, just. People noticed that Mary Ann was coming over to see Tom a lot. That he was paying her a lot of attention. Someone saw them having lunch together a couple of times. But that doesn't mean anything, Jay. People like to speculate." "Dinner?" Jason felt his throat tighten. "When?" "I don't know exactly," Mark shrugged, but his voice was cautious. "Maybe a month ago, in a cafe across the street from the office. They were discussing some project, I think. Nothing special." "Nothing like that," Jason repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mark looked at him, his eyes full of sympathy. "Because no one wanted to mess with your family, Jay. It's just rumors. You know Mary Ann. She's not like that." Jason nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He thanked Mark and walked over to the window, feeling his world begin to unravel. He watched Mary Ann, who was now dancing with Kate, her movements graceful, but he could see that her smile was a mask. He noticed some of the guests whispering among themselves, glancing from her to him. Even Paul, usually loud and carefree, seemed quieter as Jason passed. He decided to give it another try and approached Mary Ann's friend Lisa, who was standing at the refreshment table, choosing canapés. Lisa, a short brunette with a good-natured smile, was always straightforward, and Jason hoped she would tell the truth. "Lisa," he began, trying to sound casual, "did you hear what Bradley said?" Lisa froze, her hand holding the canapé in midair. "Oh, Jason, that was just drunk chatter. Don't pay attention." "I'm trying," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "But I want to know what they're saying. You're Mary Ann's friend. Have you heard anything?" Lisa looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Jay, I don't want to get into this. But, yeah, I heard some stuff. Nothing serious, just people noticed that Mary Ann was seeing Tom a lot. That he was attentive to her. But he's her boss, Jay. It's normal." "Fine," Jason repeated, feeling his heart squeeze. "What else did you hear?" Lisa hesitated, her fingers fiddling nervously with the rim of her plate. "Well, someone said they went to a conference together a couple of months ago, and that they, well, weren't exactly acting like colleagues. But that's just hearsay, Jay. I don't believe it. Mary Ann loves you." Jason nodded, but his gaze was cold. He thanked Lisa and walked away, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. The rumors he had first dismissed as drunken gossip now seemed like a web he had been caught in. He looked at the guests, at their smiles, their laughter, and felt that almost everyone knew, or at least had heard. And no one had told him. Mary Ann, noticing his grim face, came closer, her smile strained. "Jason, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but with concern. He looked at her, his eyes full of questions he didn't dare ask. "I'm fine," he lied, but his voice gave him away. "Just tired." She nodded, but her gaze was distant. "I'll go check on the coffee," she said, and went into the kitchen, leaving him alone in the crowd. The party went on, but to Jason it had become a noisy backdrop that hid a truth he was afraid to know. The guests danced, sang, laughed, but he felt that their glances, their whispers, their awkward pauses spoke louder than their words. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that this night would change everything. The night, filled with laughter, music, and the clink of glasses, finally faded, leaving the Roberts house in an unusual silence. Jason and Mary Ann's 15th wedding anniversary party had lasted well past midnight, and the guests, warmed by alcohol and merriment, were reluctant to leave, taking with them snatches of conversation, laughter, and, of course, gossip. By morning, the living room, recently glowing with the warmth of garlands and flower arrangements, looked like a battlefield. Empty glasses, crumpled napkins, cake crumbs on the tablecloth, and the faint smell of wine permeating the air. The backyard, lit by lanterns, now seemed cold and empty, and the stars, bright at night, had faded in the pre-dawn sky. Jason was awake. He was sitting alone in the kitchen, with a mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. His dark hair, slightly streaked with gray, was tousled, and his shirt, still the same one he had worn yesterday, was wrinkled. His eyes, usually alert, were now tinted with fatigue and something else, a shadow of doubt that had settled in his soul after Bradley's words and his conversations with Zach, Mark, and Lisa. The rumors about Mary Ann and her boss, Tom Hartman, which he had initially dismissed as drunken chatter, now took shape like ghosts emerging from the shadows. He tried to convince himself that it was all a lie, but the looks of his guests, their awkward pauses, their evasive answers suggested that the truth might be more complicated than he wanted to believe. Mary Ann went to bed immediately after the last of the guests had left, without saying a word. Her silence, her distance, her gaze filled with pain, and something else Jason couldn't quite make out, only increased his anxiety. He wanted to follow her, to ask, to demand an explanation, but instead he stayed in the kitchen, staring into his empty mug as if it might provide the answers. Morning came quietly, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft golden light into the kitchen. Jason heard footsteps on the porch and went to the door, expecting to see the mailman or one of the neighbors returning a forgotten tray. But it was Sarah, their neighbor across the street. Sarah, a woman in her 50s with short brown hair and a good-natured smile, was holding the glass bowl in which she had delivered her signature potato salad the day before. "Good morning, Jason," she said, her voice soft but slightly awkward. "I just came by to get a bowl, and I wanted to ask if you were okay." Jason forced a smile, though it was forced. "Hello, Sarah. It's okay. Just tired from yesterday. Come in. Want some coffee?" Sarah nodded, her gaze searching as if she were trying to read something in his face. She walked into the kitchen, set the bowl on the counter, and sat down while Jason poured her coffee from the machine. They were silent for a few seconds, and the silence was heavy, as if they both knew this conversation would be difficult. "The party was wonderful," Sarah began, her fingers curling around the warm mug. "Mary Ann outdid herself. That cake, those flowers, she's a real magician." "Yeah, she can," Jason said, his voice even but tired. He sat down across from her, looking at her. "Sarah, be honest. Did you hear what Bradley said yesterday about Mary Ann and her boss?" Sarah froze, her eyes widening for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "Oh, Jason, that guy was dead drunk. Never mind. People say things, especially after a few too many drinks." Jason leaned closer, his gaze sharpening. "I know he was drunk, but he sounded like he knew something, and I noticed the way people looked at me after he said it. Did you hear anything, Sarah? Be honest." Sarah looked away, her fingers tapping nervously on her mug. She sighed, as if debating whether to speak. "Jason, I didn't want to intrude, but yeah, I heard some stuff. Not from Bradley, but from others. Linda, for example, on our street. She works in the same building as Mary Ann, and she mentioned that she'd seen Mary Ann stop by to see her boss a lot, and that he was, well, very attentive to her. She paused, her voice quieter. Linda said that they'd had lunch together a couple of times, and that he'd given her rides home when her car was in for repairs. Jason felt his heart clench. He clenched his fists under the table, trying to stay calm. "What else do they say?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of sympathy. "Jason, it's all just rumors. People like to make things up. Someone saw them together at some work meeting, and someone noticed that he was always praising her. But it doesn't mean anything. I didn't want to tell you because, well, I thought it would only upset you. You and Mary Ann are such a great couple. I didn't want this nonsense to break you up." "For my peace of mind," Jason repeated, his voice bitter. "Everyone kept quiet for my peace of mind. Zach, Mark, Lisa, now you. Why didn't anyone tell me before?" Sarah shook her head, her expression full of regret. "Because we didn't believe it, Jason. I don't. Mary Ann loves you. She always speaks of you with such fondness. I thought it was just gossip that would die down on its own." Jason nodded, but his gaze was distant. He thanked Sarah and walked her to the door, feeling a storm building inside him. The rumors he had dismissed as drunken gossip now felt like a net he had been caught in. Every new conversation, every evasive glance from the guests at last night's party confirmed that these rumors weren't just Bradley's inventions, they had a life of their own, spreading like wildfire. Back in the kitchen, Jason tried to keep himself busy by collecting the empty glasses and putting them in the dishwasher. But his mind was elsewhere. He remembered how Mary Ann had been working late more often in recent months, how she avoided talking about her day, how her smiles had become less likely to reach her eyes. He wanted to believe that it was all understandable stress, fatigue, work, but Sarah's words, her careful hints, her sympathetic glances only added fuel to the fire. In the afternoon, when the sun was already high, there was a knock at the door. It was Alex, Jason's cousin, who had been one of the noisiest guests at the party the night before. Alex, a burly guy with a dark beard and a habit of saying whatever he thought, stumbled into the house with a wide grin, holding a bottle of beer that he had apparently started drinking on the way in. "Jay, man," he exclaimed, clapping Jason on the shoulder. "So, did you survive last night? What an epic party. Mary Ann is a queen, I tell you." Jason forced a smile, but his eyes remained serious. "Yeah, it was fun. Come in, Alex. Want some coffee?" "Coffee?" Alex laughed, raising the bottle. "I'm on my own fuel, brother. But let's sit and chat. I feel like you need some air after yesterday." They sat in the backyard, where the party still had its remnants. Empty bottles on the table, crumpled napkins on the grass. Jason looked at Alex, trying to figure out if he knew anything. Alex had always been straightforward, and Jason figured if anyone would tell the truth, it would be him. "Alex," Jason began, his voice calm but tense. "Did you hear what Bradley said yesterday about Mary Ann and her boss?" Alex froze, his smile fading slightly. He took a long swig of beer, clearly stalling. "Oh, that jerk. He was a wreck, Jay. Never mind. He always talks crap when he's drunk." "I know," Jason said, his gaze sharpening. "But he sounded like he knew something, and I noticed the way people looked at me after he said it. Did you hear anything in the office from anyone else?" Alex scratched his beard, his eyes avoiding Jason's. "Look, bro, I don't want to get into this, but yeah, I heard something. From a guy at work, he knows someone at your firm," said Mary Ann and this Tom. "Well, they're close, that she's in his office a lot, that he's promoting her, and that, well, you know, people like to make things up." "Find out what?" Jason asked, his voice sharpening. "What exactly are they saying?" Alex sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Okay, Jay, don't be mad. They say they had some kind of affair, that she went to a conference with him, and they were too close, and that he gave her some expensive earrings for her birthday. But those were all rumors, bro. I didn't believe it. That's why I didn't tell you. Didn't want you to freak out over some stupid thing. Earrings. Jason felt his throat tighten. He remembered Mary Ann coming home on her last birthday with new earrings, gold ones with little sapphires. She'd said she'd bought them herself, but he'd noticed she'd quickly changed the subject when he'd asked where she'd gotten them. Yeah, but that's probably just talk, Alex added quickly, noticing Jason's face darkened. I didn't want to tell you because, well, you and Mary are such a perfect couple. I thought it would all go away on its own. For my peace of mind, Jason said, his voice bitter, almost venomous. Everyone kept quiet for my peace of mind. Zach, Mark, Lisa, Sarah, now you. Why didn't anyone tell me? Alex raised his hands defensively. Jay, I didn't mean to interfere with your family. I thought you could figure it out on your own. Mary Ann, she's not like that. I don't believe she would. But you heard, Jason interrupted, his voice cold. And you kept quiet. Alex nodded, his face full of regret. Sorry, brother. I thought it was better than adding fuel to the fire. Jason stood up, his movements jerky, as if he were trying to physically brush off Alex's words. Thanks for your honesty, he said, but there was no warmth in his voice. He walked into the house, leaving Alex alone on the porch, a bottle of beer in his hand and guilt in his heart. Inside the house, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Mary Ann hadn't come down yet, and Jason was grateful for that he wasn't ready to talk. He sat on the living room couch, looking at the remains of last night's celebration. Empty glasses, crumpled napkins, wilted flowers. He felt his world, so familiar and secure, crumbling like a house of cards. The rumors he'd initially dismissed as drunken gossip were now everywhere in the words of friends, the looks of neighbors, the evasive answers of colleagues. And they were all silent, ostensibly for his own peace of mind. He remembered how Mary Ann had avoided his gaze the night before, how her smile had been forced, how she had gone to bed without a word. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe it was all a lie, but every new version of the truth he heard added a crack to their marriage. He looked at the wedding ring on his finger, and for the first time in 15 years, it felt like a stranger. The day dragged on, and Jason knew he would have to talk to Mary Ann soon. But for now, he sat in silence, listening to the clock tick and feeling the truth, whatever it was, approaching like a storm. The morning after the anniversary party at the Roberts home was quiet, but the silence was not comforting, it was heavy, like the air before a storm. The sun streamed through the large living room windows, revealing the remnants of the previous night's celebration. Crumpled napkins, forgotten glasses, wilted rose petals fallen from the flower arrangements. The scents of vanilla custard and roasted meat still hung in the air, but now there was a faint smell of spilled wine that had soaked the tablecloth. The house, so full of laughter and music, seemed empty, as if the guests had taken with them not only their voices, but also the warmth that made the place come alive. Jason sat on the living room couch, his fingers wrapped around an empty coffee mug. He had been up most of the night, his mind racing over the words of Bradley, the drunk coworker who had loudly claimed the previous night that Mary Ann was having an affair with their boss, Tom Hartman. The words, which had seemed like a wild guess at first, had now been fleshed out in conversations with Zach, Mark, Lisa, Sarah, and Alex. Each of them had reluctantly and tentatively confirmed that the rumors had been going on for a long time, about Mary Ann's frequent visits to Tom's office, about her radiant appearance after these encounters, about how he'd given her rides home or expensive earrings. They had all kept quiet, ostensibly for his peace of mind, but their silence only served to intensify his doubts, like poison slowly coursing through his veins. Mary Ann had not yet come down from the top floor. After the guests had left, she had gone into the bedroom without a word, and Jason had not followed her, sensing that talking at that moment could end in disaster. But now that the morning had brought clarity and silence, he knew he could put it off no longer. He had to talk to her, look her in the eye, and hear the truth, whatever it was. The living room was spacious, with high ceilings and large windows that looked out onto the backyard. The sofas were upholstered in soft gray fabric and strewn with the pillows that Mary Ann had carefully chosen to make everything look perfect. A vase of white lilies, slightly wilted, sat on the coffee table, and a couple of forgotten children's toys lay on the floor, remnants of yesterday's chaos. Jason looked at it all and his heart sank. This house, their home, had been their refuge, their fortress, but now it seemed as fragile as a house of cards, ready to collapse at the wrong word. He heard footsteps on the stairs, light but slow, as if the person descending was in no hurry to meet whatever was waiting below. Mary Ann appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and in place of the elegant dress of the day before, she was wearing soft linen trousers and a white t-shirt. She looked tired but still beautiful, the kind of beauty that had not faded with age, but now seemed shadowed. Her eyes, usually bright, were slightly bloodshot, as if she, too, had not slept. "Good morning," she said, her voice quiet, almost neutral, but there was a sense of caution in it. She walked over to the coffee machine on the island that separated the kitchen from the living room. "Want more coffee?" Jason shook his head, his gaze fixed on her. "No, thank you. Mary, we need to talk." She froze, her hand reaching for the coffee machine, stopping in midair. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders tensed slightly. "What?" she asked, her voice even but with a note of alarm. Jason stood up from the couch, his movements slow but determined. He walked over to the island, stopping a few feet away from her. "You know what? What Bradley said yesterday, and what the others are saying." Mary Ann finally turned, her eyes meeting his, but she quickly looked away, focusing on the coffee machine as if that would save her from the conversation. "Jason, that was drunken nonsense. You don't believe that crap, do you?" He took a step closer, his voice lower but steely. "I want to believe you, Mary, but yesterday, after what Bradley said, I talked to Zach, to Mark, to Lisa, to Sarah, to Alex. They all heard something. About you and Tom, about how you were in his office a lot, about the lunches, about him giving you rides home, about the earrings he gave you." Mary Ann paled, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face, usually calm and confident, was now betraying fear, not the obvious kind, but the kind that lurked in the corners of her eyes, the slight tremor of her lips. "Earrings," she repeated, her voice shaking. "I bought them myself, Jason. You know that." "I know," he said, but his voice was cold. "You said so. But now I hear people think differently. And I see the way you act. You avoid me, Mary. You don't look me in the eye. You avoid conversations. What's going on?" She turned to him, her eyes flashing, but there was more hurt in them than anger. "Nothing's happening, Jason. Nothing. I work with Tom, he's my boss. Of course I'm in his office. Of course we discuss projects. That's my job. And the rumors, people always talk. You know how it is." Jason stepped closer, his gaze hard, as if he were trying to peer into her soul. "Then why are you so afraid? I can see it, Mary. You're shaking. You can't look me in the eye. If this is all a lie, why are you acting like you're hiding something?" Mary Ann pressed her lips together, her eyes shining as she fought back tears. She turned away, fiddling with the coffee machine, though it was clear she didn't need coffee right now. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, her voice quiet but tight. "I'm just tired, Jason. Tired of work, of this party, of everyone meddling in our lives. Do you really think I could, with Tom, after 15 years with you?" Jason looked at her, his heart pounding so loudly he was afraid she'd hear it. He wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to her words like a lifeline, but her fear, her evasiveness, her shaking hands, all of it screamed that the truth was more complicated. "Then tell me," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Look me in the eyes and tell me there's nothing between you and Tom." Mary Ann froze, her hand shaking as she held her coffee cup, a few drops spilling onto the countertop. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, but there was something in them he couldn't quite place, a mixture of fear, guilt, and desperation. "There's nothing between me and Tom," she said, her voice firm, but her face, her eyes betraying her. She quickly turned away, wiping up the spilled coffee with a rag, as if that would distract him. Jason felt his throat tighten. He took a step back, his hands falling to his sides as if he'd lost something important. "Why don't I believe you?" he asked, his voice thick with pain. "Mary, I've known you for 15 years. I can tell when you're lying." She turned sharply, her eyes flashing with anger. "I'm not lying," she almost shouted, but her voice broke. "Do you really think I'd do that? Do you think I'd betray you? Our family? Our children?" "I don't know what to think," he answered honestly, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't talk to me. You leave me. You stay late at work, you come home, and you don't say anything. And now these rumors. Everyone knew, Mary. Zach, Mark, Lisa, Sarah, Alex, they all heard. And no one told me because, you see, they didn't want to upset me. And you act like you have something to hide." Mary Ann threw the rag down on the counter, her movements abrupt, almost desperate. She crossed her arms over her chest, as if in defense. "That's not fair, Jason. You're accusing me based on gossip, on the words of a drunken idiot. Do you really think that's what I am?" "I don't want to think that," he said, his voice shaking. "But I see your fear. I see how you're avoiding me. Tell me the truth, Mary. What's going on? If this is all a lie, why are you so afraid?" She was silent, her lips trembling, her eyes filling with tears she desperately tried to hold back. She turned away, looking out the window, where the sun played on the grass of the backyard. "I'm not afraid," she said finally, but her voice was barely audible. I'm tired of all this, of your suspicions. If you don't trust me." Jason took a step toward her, his hand reaching for her shoulder, but he stopped, hesitant to touch her. "Mary, I want to trust you, but I need to know. Was there something between you and Tom? Anything?" She turned sharply, her eyes burning, but tears were already rolling down her cheeks. "No, Jason, nothing happened. I work with him. I respect him as a boss. But that's all." Her voice was firm, but her face, her shaking hands, her tears told a different story. He looked at her, his heart torn between wanting to believe her and fearing that she was lying. "Then why are you crying?" he asked, his voice soft, almost pleading. "If this is all a lie, why do you look like this?" Mary Ann wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her movements sharp, almost angry. "Because you don't believe me," she said, her voice breaking. "Because you stand here and accuse me based on some stupid rumor. Because I'm tired, Jason. Tired of all this." He wanted to answer, wanted to say that he was tired too, that he was afraid of losing her, that he just wanted the truth. But the words stuck in his throat. He looked at her tears, at her trembling hands, and felt the gap growing between them invisible, but insurmountable. "I don't know how to move forward," he said finally, his voice quiet but full of pain. "If you're telling the truth, why can't I believe you?" Mary Ann was silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. She pressed her lips together, as if afraid she might say something she couldn't take back. Finally, she looked up, her voice barely audible. "I don't know, Jason. Maybe because you've already decided it's my fault." He shook his head, his hands falling to his sides. "I haven't decided. I don't know what to think. But I can't live like this, not knowing." She nodded, her eyes full of tears, but she no longer tried to hold them back. "Then maybe you need time," she said, her voice cold, as if she were closing a door. "Maybe we both need time." Jason looked at her, feeling his world crumble. He wanted to hold her, to tell her everything would be okay, but her words, her eyes, her tears kept him at a distance. He nodded, unable to find the words, and walked out of the living room, leaving her alone at the kitchen island. Mary Ann stood there, her hands shaking and tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked at the empty mug he had left on the table and felt her heart breaking. She wanted to tell him everything, not about Tom, not about the rumors, but about what had happened to her these past months, about her fatigue, her fears, how lost she had felt. But she couldn't. Not now. Not after his words, his suspicions, his look of pain and distrust. The living room was quiet, but that silence was louder than any words. Outside, the sun was rising higher, illuminating their home, their life, their marriage that seemed to be falling apart. And in that silence, Mary Ann knew that the truth, whatever it was, had already changed everything. The sun was high above the Roberts house, casting a bright light across the backyard that made the grass look unnaturally green and the flower beds ablaze with color. The previous night's party, celebrating Jason and Mary Ann's 15th wedding anniversary, had left a mess in its wake. Empty bottles littered the patio table, crumpled napkins on the lawn, and the strings of lanterns that had sparkled like stars at night now hung dim and useless. The house was quiet, not the kind that comforted, but the kind that oppressed, as if foreshadowing a storm. The living room, which had been full of laughter and music the day before, now looked like an abandoned stage. The tablecloth was stained with wine, rose petals had fallen to the floor, and the air was thick with the cloying scent of vanilla, mingled with the sourness of spilled alcohol. Jason sat on the porch in a wicker chair, staring out at the lawn where bees buzzed over flowers and butterflies fluttered past, seemingly oblivious to his turmoil. He held a bottle of water in his hands, cold and foggy, but he didn't drink it, his fingers simply clutching the plastic, as if that would keep him from falling into the abyss of doubt. His dark hair, slightly grayed, was tousled, and his face, usually calm and confident, was now shadowed by fatigue. His conversation with Mary Ann that morning had left him devastated. Her tears, her trembling voice, her evasive answers to questions about Tom Hartman, her boss, had only fueled his suspicions. Bradley, her drunken co-worker, had told him that she was having an affair with Tom, which he had initially dismissed as nonsense, but now others, Zach, Mark, Lisa, Sarah, Alex, had confirmed it. Each of them, reluctantly and with reservations, mentioned the rumors about her frequent visits to Tom's office, about her radiant appearance after meetings, about his gifts and attention. They all kept silent, ostensibly so as not to upset him, but this silence hurt deeper than any words. Mary Ann had gone to bed after their morning talk, citing a headache, and Jason hadn't stopped her. He felt like one more word would have destroyed everything that was left between them. He sat on the porch, listening to the buzzing of the bees and the distant barking of the neighbor's dog, trying to collect his thoughts, but they were slipping away like smoke. He wanted to believe Mary Ann, wanted to cling to her words that there was nothing between her and Tom, but her fear, her evasiveness, her tears told a different story. The door to the porch creaked, and Jason turned, expecting to see Mary Ann, or maybe one of the kids coming home from Grandma's. But it was Haley, his little sister. At 30, Haley was a hurricane. Blonde hair, a sharp tongue, and a habit of telling the truth to anyone's face, even when it didn't please anyone. Yesterday, she'd been the life of the party, dancing her ass off, singing karaoke, and encouraging everyone to join in the fun. Today, she looked different. Her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, her bright dress replaced by jeans and a loose t-shirt, and her eyes, which usually sparkled with mischief, were now filled with worry. "Hey, little brother," she said, her voice soft but careful, as if she were treading on thin ice. She sat down in the chair opposite him, holding a cup of tea that was steaming slightly. "You look like you've been run over by a truck." Jason tried to smile, but it came out crooked, almost painful. "Just tired, Haley. Yesterday was too much." She nodded, her gaze sliding over his face as if she were trying to read his thoughts. "Yeah, the party was awesome. Mary Ann gave it her all. But I saw the way you looked at her, and the way she looked at you. What happened, Jay?" He took a deep breath, his fingers squeezing the water bottle so hard the plastic cracked. "Did you hear what Bradley said yesterday about Mary Ann and her boss?" Haley froze, her hand hovering over the cup. She looked out at the lawn where butterflies danced over the flowers, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, I heard him," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "He was dead drunk, Jay. You know how he likes to talk." "I know," Jason said, his voice low but steely. But he sounded like he knew something. "And I noticed the way people looked at me after he spoke. I talked to Zach, Mark, Lisa, Sarah, Alex. They all heard something about Mary Ann coming over to Tom's place, about their dinners, about the earrings he gave her. He paused, his gaze sharpening. What about you? Did you hear anything? Haley set her cup down on the table, her movements slow, almost measured. She looked up at him, her eyes full of a mixture of regret, guilt, and determination. Jay, she began, her voice soft but firm. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want you to find out like this. But, yeah, I heard. And not just heard, I know. Jason felt his heart skip a beat. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on his sister. You know? What do you know, Haley? She sighed, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her shirt. I've known for a couple months. Before this party. My friend Claire works at the same firm as Mary Ann. She told me everything. Haley paused, her eyes meeting Jason's, and there was so much pain in them that his throat tightened. Mary Ann and Tom, they're having an affair. It's not just rumors, Jay. Claire saw them together. Not at the office, not at lunch. She saw them kissing in Tom's car after some office party. And it wasn't a one-time thing. Jason froze, his breathing heavy as if the air had turned to lead. He looked at Haley, searching her face for some hint that she was wrong, that this was a lie. But her eyes, her voice, her tight lips said otherwise. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. You're my sister, Haley. You should have told me. She shook her head, her eyes shining, but she was holding back tears. I wanted to, Jay. I swear I wanted to. But I saw how happy you were with her. The way you looked at her. The way you built this life, the house, the kids, everything. I thought if I told you, it would ruin everything. I thought maybe it was just a mistake, that Mary Ann would come to her senses. I didn't want you to suffer. Suffered? Jason almost shouted, his voice breaking. He stood up, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles were white. You think that's not suffering? Knowing that everyone was whispering, that everyone knew but me? Zach, Mark, Lisa, Sarah, Alex. You all kept quiet because, you see, you didn't want to upset me. And now I'm standing here like an idiot, hearing my wife. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. His chest heaved as if he were suffocating. Haley stood, her face full of pain. She took a step toward him, but stopped, hesitant to touch him. Jay, I know it hurts. I know what I should have said. But I was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't survive this. That it would break you. She paused, her voice quieter. But I have something else. Something that could change everything. Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. What? He asked, his voice as sharp as a blade. What else were you hiding? Haley pressed her lips together, her gaze hardening. Not here, Jay. Not now. Let's meet tomorrow. I'll tell you everything. But it's important. It might. I don't know. Maybe it'll give you answers. Or at least a choice. He looked at her, his thoughts a chaos. He wanted to scream, to demand that she tell him everything now, but her face, her voice, her seriousness stopped him. He nodded, his movements jerky, almost mechanical. Okay, he said, his voice cold. Tomorrow. But Haley, if you keep anything back again. I won't, she interrupted, her voice firm. I swear, Jay, I'll tell you everything. She took a step toward him, her hand touching his shoulder, but he pulled away, his gaze distant. I need time, he said, his voice barely audible. Just go away, Haley. She nodded, her eyes full of tears, but she didn't argue. She picked up her cup and walked away, her steps soft on the wooden floor of the porch. Jason watched her go, feeling his world crumble. Her confession, her hint of some kind of trump card, was a blow he didn't know how to recover from. He sat back in his chair, his hands shaking, his mind racing with only one question. What else didn't he know? The house was silent, except for the clock on the wall, ticking away the seconds. Somewhere upstairs, Mary Ann might still be in bed, or pretending to be asleep. Jason looked out at the lawn, at the butterflies, at the blue sky, and felt that his life, his marriage, his love, all hung in the balance. Tomorrow's conversation with Haley, whatever she said, would change everything. To fully meet your request, I will expand the text to 4,000 words, adding more details, dialogues, and Jason's inner world, while maintaining dynamics and realism. Here is the continuation. Jason stayed on the porch, his gaze wandering across the lawn, but he saw nothing, no bright flowers, no fluttering butterflies, no blue sky that seemed too clear for such a day. His thoughts were a seething cauldron, images of Marianne, her tears, her shaking hands, her evasive gaze, mingling with Bradley's drunken words, with the cautious confessions of Zach, Mark, Lisa, Sarah, Alex, and now with Haley's hard revelation. Her words, I know, it's not just a rumor. She saw them kiss hit him like a hammer, over and over, giving him no respite. He wanted to scream, to smash something, to let the pain out, but instead he sat still, clutching the water bottle until the plastic began to crack under his fingers. He remembered the first time he had met Mary Ann at a college party where she had stood against the wall, holding a plastic cup of cheap beer, laughing at a joke. Her smile had been real then, not the rehearsed one he had seen yesterday. She had been the light in the room, and he, an awkward freshman, had worked up the courage to approach her, muttering something stupid about music. She had laughed, and that laugh had anchored him for years. 15 years, 2 children, this house, their lives, everything had been built around that laughter, that love. And now he didn't know how much of it was true. Haley had said she had something else, some kind of bargaining chip that could change everything. What could it be? Evidence, letters, photographs, notes, or something worse, something that would make the truth even more unbearable. Jason felt his mind conjuring up images, each worse than the last. Mary Ann and Tom's car, their hands, their lips, their eyes filled with what had once been his. He clenched his jaw, trying to push the images away, but they kept coming back like pesky flies. He stood up, his movements jerky, almost ragged. He paced the porch, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. He wanted to go into the house, up to the bedroom, wake Mary Ann and demand the truth, the whole truth, without her tears, without her evasions. But he paused at the door, his hand hovering on the handle. What if she lied again? What if she confessed? He didn't know which would be worse. Instead, he returned to the chair, sat down, and closed his eyes, trying to remember when it all began to fall apart. Mary Ann had been different in recent months, quieter, more distant, her smiles less frequent, her conversations shorter. She'd stayed late at work, citing projects, deadlines, Tom, who trusted her more than anyone. Jason hadn't thought much of it, then he'd trusted her, been proud of her successes, her ambitions. But now, every late arrival, every evasive answer, came back to him like evidence. He remembered her coming home a couple of months ago with new earrings, gold ones with little sapphires that sparkled in the lamplight. Bought them for myself, she had said, smiling, but quickly changed the subject when he asked where she got them. He hadn't pressed them, he hadn't wanted to seem petty, but now Alex's words about Tom giving them to him burned him like a hot iron. Jason opened his eyes, his gaze falling on the ring on his finger, the simple gold band he and Mary Ann had chosen together before their wedding. It was modest, but it meant everything to him, the promise they had made to each other. Now it felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else in another life. He heard footsteps inside the house and tensed, but it was not Mary Ann, but their neighbor Sarah, coming in for her bowl. She had been there earlier that morning, and her cautious words about the rumors, about how Mary Ann had often been seen with Tom, only added weight to his doubts. He did not want to see her again, did not want another conversation that would end in sympathetic looks and empty consolations. He remained on the porch, hoping that she would leave without noticing him. But the silence of the house was deceptive. He knew Mary Ann would be down soon, and then they would have to talk again. He wasn't ready, but he couldn't wait any longer. Haley had promised to tell him something tomorrow, but tomorrow was too far away, and his thoughts were already eating him up inside. He stood up, deciding it was time to act, or at least try to figure out what else his sister was hiding. He walked into the house, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The living room was silent, except for the clock on the wall, ticking away the seconds. He walked to the kitchen, where the coffee machine was still running, and poured himself some water, even though he knew it wouldn't quench his thirst, not the one in his throat, but the one in his soul. Mary Ann came down an hour later, her footsteps almost silent. She walked into the living room, her hair loose and her face pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She looked at Jason, her eyes wary, as if she were expecting a blow. "Are you still here?" she asked, her voice quiet but tired. "I thought you went out somewhere, to get some fresh air." "Where should I go?" he replied, his voice sharp, but he immediately regretted it. "Mary, we need to talk, again." She pressed her lips together, her arms crossed over her chest, as if she were defending herself. "We've talked about this, Jason. I told you everything. There's nothing. Nothing." He took a step toward her, his gaze hard, but there was pain in it as well as anger. "I just talked to Haley. She said she knew. Not just rumors, Mary. She said her friend saw you with Tom, in his car, kissing." Mary Ann went pale, her eyes wide, but she quickly composed herself. "It's a lie," she said, her voice firm but her hands shaking. "Haley's wrong. Her friend's wrong. I don't know what she saw, but it wasn't me." Jason looked at her, his heart pounding so loudly he was afraid she would hear. "Then why are you shaking?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Why can't you look me in the eye? If this is a lie, why are you so afraid?" She turned away, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I'm not afraid," she said, but her voice was catching. "I'm just tired, Jason. Tired of you being suspicious. Tired of you believing everyone but me." "I want to believe you," he said, his voice full of pain. "But I can't. Not after what I've heard. Not after the way you're acting. Mary, tell me the truth. Please." She was silent, her gaze fixed on the floor, tears beginning to gather in the corners of her eyes. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, her movement sharp, almost angry. "I told you the truth," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "But you've already decided that I'm guilty." Jason wanted to answer, wanted to say that he hadn't decided, that he just wanted to understand, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at her tears, at her shaking hands, and felt the gap growing between them. He turned and walked back out onto the porch, leaving her alone in the living room. There, in the bright sun, he sat in a chair, his thoughts a mess. Haley knew. She knew more than she had said, and she had promised to tell him tomorrow. But what could it be? What kind of trump card did she have? Jason looked out at the lawn, at the flowers, at the sky, and felt his life crumbling like a sandcastle. And he knew that tomorrow, no matter what Haley said, everything would change forever. It was a warm July evening, and the Roberts house was bathed in the soft light of the setting sun filtering through the old maple tree by the front porch. Inside, the house seemed frozen. The remnants of the previous night's anniversary party wine stains on the carpet, empty glasses on the coffee table, wilted flowers in vases made it seem as if time had stood still. But the silence was deceptive, like the calm before a storm. Jason stood at the kitchen island, staring at the dregs of his morning coffee in the coffee maker, which was still humming quietly. His fingers tapped nervously on the countertop, his mind reeling over the conversation he'd had with his younger sister, Haley, the day before, who'd confessed to knowing about Mary Ann's affair with her boss, Tom Hartman. Her words, "I know, it's not just rumors," she saw them kissing, burned him like a hot iron, and her hint at some trump card that she promised to reveal today only increased his anxiety. He hadn't slept all night, going over everything he'd learned in the last few days. Bradley's drunken revelations, Zach's, Mark's, Lisa's, Sarah's, Alex's, and finally Haley's hard confirmation. They'd all heard rumors about Mary Ann and Tom, her frequent visits to his office, her radiant appearance, his gifts, the car they'd been seen in together, and they'd all kept quiet, ostensibly for his own peace of mind. But Haley's words weren't just rumors, she knew, and her promise to reveal more today made his heart pound with a mixture of fear and anger. Mary Ann left for work early that morning, not saying a word since their conversation the night before, where she had denied everything, but her shaking hands and tears betrayed her fear. Jason was alone in the house. The children were at their grandmother's, and this emptiness pressed on him like a concrete slab. He tried to keep himself busy cleaning, but every glass, every crumpled napkin reminded him of the party where it all began, where his world began to crumble. The doorbell rang, startling him out of his thoughts. He opened it to find Haley standing on the porch. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and in her jeans and gray t-shirt, she looked more like a teenager than a 30-year-old woman, but her eyes were serious, almost stern. She was clutching a bag, and her lips were pressed into a thin line, as if she were preparing for battle. "Hi, Jay," she said, her voice calm but tense. "Can we talk? Like I promised, I'll tell you everything." He nodded, his throat tight. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. They walked into the living room, where Haley sat down on the couch, setting her bag down next to her. Jason remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on his sister. "Well," he said, his voice low but firm. "What's the deal? What have you been hiding?" Haley sighed, her fingers fiddling nervously with the strap of her bag. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and determination. "Before I start, Jay, I want you to understand. I didn't mean for this to happen. I kept it to myself because I thought it would be better. But after yesterday, I realized I couldn't keep quiet any longer." "Stop beating around the bush," he interrupted, his voice sharpening. "You said you knew about Mary Ann and Tom. You said your friend saw them together. What else? What is this something that could change everything?" Haley looked up, her gaze hard, almost accusing. "Are you so sure Mary Ann is the one at fault, Jay?" she asked, her voice quiet but steely. "You stand here accusing her, demanding the truth. But what about you? Are you willing to be honest? Completely honest?" Jason frowned, his hands clenched into fists. "What are you talking about, Haley? Don't play with me. Get straight to the point." She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. 4 years ago, Jay, your business trip to Seattle. Remember? You were there for 3 weeks, working on a project with that new firm. And Laura Kendall, your coworker. She paused, her voice quieter, but each word a blow. "You think I don't know what you had? You think no one knows?" Jason felt the blood drain from his face. His heart was pounding so loudly he was afraid she'd hear it. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Laura, 4 years ago, Seattle. He remembered her laugh, her dark hair, the sparkle in her eyes as they stayed late in the office discussing a project. He remembered that night at the bar when they'd had too much whiskey and everything had swirled around him, her lips, her warmth, her scent. It had been a mistake, a moment of weakness he'd buried so deep that sometimes he convinced himself it hadn't happened. But Haley knew. "How?" he began, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "How did you know?" Haley smiled bitterly, her eyes full of disappointment. "You think you're that sneaky, Jay? Laura was a friend of mine from college. She called me after that trip in tears because you told her it didn't mean anything, that you loved Mary Ann, that it was a mistake. She felt used, Jay, and I promised her I wouldn't tell anyone, not even Mary Ann. But I knew. I always knew." Jason took a step back, his hands falling to his sides as if he'd lost his balance. He felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "It was once," he said, his voice weak, almost pleading. "It was 4 years ago, Haley. I was drunk. I didn't want to. I never talked about it because it meant nothing." "It didn't mean anything?" Haley jumped up from the couch, her voice louder, full of anger. "It might have meant nothing to you, but it wasn't just a night for Laura, Jay. She fell in love with you. She thought you had something. And you just went back to Mary Ann like nothing happened and left her to deal with it. And now you're standing here, all righteous, blaming Mary Ann, demanding the truth. But you hid it for 4 years. Jason's jaw clenched, his eyes pained. "It's not the same," he said, his voice firm but cracked. "It was a mistake. One time. I didn't act like it was okay. I didn't date her, give her gifts, or spend every day with her. Mary Ann, she's with Tom Haley. It's not one time. It's not a mistake. It's... He trailed off, unable to find the words. Haley stepped toward him, her eyes blazing. Are you sure you know everything, Jay? Are you sure Mary Ann didn't make the same thing one mistake? You judge her, but you won't look at yourself. You want the truth? Then be prepared for the truth to work both ways. He looked at her, his thoughts a mess. Laura, 4 years ago. He thought he'd buried it, that no one knew, that it would never come up. But Haley knew, and now she stood before him, her words like a knife stabbing into his conscience. What do you want? He asked, his voice cold but filled with pain. Why are you bringing this up? So that I'll forgive Mary Ann? So that I'll feel guilty? Haley pressed her lips together, her gaze growing sharper. I want you to be honest, Jay. With yourself. With Mary Ann. With the kids. You think you can just blame her, demand the truth from her, but you're keeping a secret like this. She paused, her voice quieter, but there was a threat in it. I didn't want to do this, but if you keep pushing Mary Ann, if you're going to ruin everything, I'm going to tell. The kids, Mom, Dad, everyone, they're going to know you're not such a saint after all. Jason felt his blood run cold. He looked at her, his eyes wide with shock. Are you threatening me? He asked, his voice barely audible. You're my sister, Haley. How can you? Because I'm tired of watching you destroy your family, she said, her voice breaking but her gaze not breaking. You want the truth? Then start with yourself. Tell Mary Ann about Laura. Look her in the eye and tell her what you did, and then maybe you can talk as equals. But if you keep blaming her, I won't stay silent. He stepped back, his back against the kitchen island. His thoughts swirled. He remembered Laura, her laughter, her tears, her voice as she begged him to stay. He remembered coming home to Mary Ann, holding her in his arms, promising himself it would never happen again. And now Haley held the secret like a weapon, threatening to destroy his world the same way he was about to destroy Mary Ann's. You won't do this, he said, but his voice was weak, almost pleading. You won't tell the children. Haley looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but her voice was firm. I will, Jay, if you don't stop. If you don't give Mary Ann a chance to explain. I don't want this to fall apart, but I won't watch you play the victim when I'm no better. She picked up her bag and headed for the door, but stopped and turned back. Think, Jay. Think about what you want. Truth or revenge. Because if you choose revenge, you'll lose everything, and I won't be able to save you. She left, leaving him alone in the living room. The door slammed softly, but the sound resonated in his chest like a blow. He sank down on the couch, his hands shaking. Laura, Mary Ann, Tom, Haley, everything mixed in his head like a toxic cocktail. He looked at the ring on his finger, at the house he and Mary Ann had built together, and felt his world crumble. Haley knew his secret, and now she held his life in her hands. And he knew that tomorrow, whatever it brought, would be the point of no return. The early morning was chilly in the Roberts house, despite the July heat that was beginning to creep through the curtains. The kitchen, once the center of the celebratory chaos of their 15th anniversary, now looked like an abandoned museum. Dirty coffee mugs sat on the counter, plates were piled in the sink, and the air was filled with the faint smell of last night's cake, mingled with the bitter aroma of cold coffee. The morning sun, soft and pale, streamed through the window, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the silence. The house was empty, the children were still at Grandma's, and the guests who had filled it with laughter and gossip 2 days ago had long since departed, taking with them their glances, their whispers, their secrets. Jason sat at the kitchen table, his fingers curled around his empty mug as if it would steady him. His dark hair, slightly gray at the temples, was tousled, and his eyes, usually clear and alert, were now tinted with fatigue and pain. The last 2 days had turned his world upside down. Bradley's drunken revelations about Mary Ann's affair with her boss, Tom Hartman, confirmations from Zach, Mark, Lisa, Sarah, Alex, and then the blow from Haley, his sister, who not only knew about Mary Ann's affair, but reminded him of his own mistake 4 years earlier with Laura Kendall. Her threat to tell his children and parents about his misdeed was like a knife in his heart. He felt trapped between anger at Mary Ann, shame in himself, and the fear of losing everything they had built together: the home, the family, the love. Mary Ann sat across from him, her hands on the table, her fingers nervously intertwined. Her face was pale, there were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair, usually neatly styled, was now hanging in tangled strands around her shoulders. She was wearing the same t-shirt and linen trousers as yesterday, as if she hadn't found the strength to change. Her gaze was fixed on the table, on the crumbs left from yesterday's bread, and she was silent, as if she was afraid that any word would destroy the delicate balance between them. They hadn't spoken since Haley had left last night, leaving Jason with her threat and her trump card, his own secret. He lay awake, replaying it all in his head. Haley's words, Mary Ann's tears, her evasive answers, her fear. He wanted revenge. He wanted to storm into Tom's office and smash his face in. He wanted to scream at Mary Ann for the truth. He wanted to expose her in front of everyone. But every time he pictured it, he saw the faces of his children Emma and Liam, their trusting eyes, their laughter, their belief that their parents were an unbreakable fortress. And he saw Laura, her tears, her voice as she begged him to stay in Seattle that night. He was no better. He was as much of a hypocrite as everyone else who had kept quiet about Mary Ann, supposedly for his own peace of mind. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and saw a mixture of fear and weariness in it. Mary Ann nodded, her fingers tightening. "I know," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But I don't know where to start." Jason clenched his jaw, his gaze hard, but there was pain in it as well as anger. "Start with the truth, Mary. I talked to Haley yesterday. She said her friend saw you with Tom, in his car, kissing. Is that true?" She paled, her eyes widening, but she looked away quickly, staring at her hands. "It's a lie," she said, but her voice was shaking, and she knew it. "Claire, she could have been wrong. It wasn't me. I didn't do it." He leaned forward, his voice sharper. "Enough, Mary. Stop lying. I can see it in your eyes. I saw it yesterday, the day before, every time I asked. You're shaking, you're avoiding me, you can't look me in the eye. If it's not true, why are you so afraid?" She looked up, her eyes full of tears, but she didn't let them fall. "Because you don't believe me," she said, her voice breaking. "Because you've already decided that I'm guilty, that I betrayed you. Our family. Do you think I'm capable of that?" Jason looked at her, his heart pounding. He wanted to believe her, wanted to hang on to her words, but her fear, her shaking hands, her evasiveness were proof. "I want to believe you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I can't. Not after what I've heard. Not after the way you've acted. And," he paused, his throat tightening, "not after what I've done." Mary Ann froze, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice wary, as if she sensed she was about to hear something she hadn't expected. Jason clenched his fists under the table, his gaze falling to the ring on his finger. He could feel Haley's words weighing on him, her threat to tell his kids and his parents about his mistake with Laura. He knew he had to be honest if he wanted the truth from her. "4 years ago," he began, his voice rough, almost painful. "In Seattle, I was on a business trip with Laura Kendall. We had too much whiskey at a bar, and it was a mistake, Mary. One time, I never told you because it meant nothing. I thought I buried it. But Haley knows. She's known all along." Mary Ann looked at him, her face as still as a mask. Her eyes, full of tears a moment ago, were now empty, as if she were trying to process his words. "You," she began, but her voice broke. "You cheated on me 4 years ago, and you kept quiet?" He nodded, his eyes full of shame. "Yes, I was weak. I was drunk. It was a mistake, Mary. I came home, I looked at you, at the children, and I swore it would never happen again. I thought I could live with it, that it wouldn't hurt. But now I see that it makes me as much of a hypocrite as everyone else who kept quiet about you and Tom." She was silent, her hands shaking, and the tears she had been holding back were now rolling down her cheeks. "Do you think that excuses you?" she asked, her voice full of pain. "Do you think that your mistake made me, my guilt, any less?" Jason leaned closer, his eyes full of despair. "I don't know, Mary. I don't know what's going on with you and Tom. But I know we're both imperfect. I know we've both hurt each other. But I don't want revenge. I don't want to destroy our family. I want the truth. And I'm willing to tell you everything if you do the same." Mary Ann turned away, her gaze falling on the window, where the first rays of sunlight were illuminating the lawn. She was silent for so long that Jason thought she wouldn't answer. But finally she spoke, her voice barely audible. "It's true," she said, and the words were like a blow. "With Tom, it happened. Not like you think. Not an affair. But it did. Once. At a conference 3 months ago. We were drinking, and we were talking, and I don't know how it happened. I hated myself for it. I hate myself now." Jason felt his heart stop. He'd expected this, feared it, but her words were still like a knife. He looked at her tears, at her shaking hands, and felt his world crumble completely. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse, full of pain. "Why didn't you tell me?" She shook her head, tears falling onto the table. "Because I knew it would destroy us. I knew you wouldn't forgive. I wanted to forget, wanted to pretend it never happened. But I couldn't. And now everyone knows." He looked at her, his thoughts a mess. He wanted to scream, he wanted to leave, he wanted to hug her and tell her everything would be okay. But he knew nothing would ever be the same again. "So what now?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost broken. "What do we do? Get a divorce? Tell the kids? Pretend nothing happened?" Mary Ann looked up, her eyes full of pain but also determination. "I don't know, Jay, but I know I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose Emma and Liam. I know it's my fault. But you too. We both made mistakes. And now we either ruin it or try to save it." He looked at her, his heart torn between anger and love. He remembered Haley, her threat, her words about him being no better. He remembered Laura, her tears, her voice. And he remembered Mary Ann, her laughter, her warmth, her love that had anchored him for 15 years. He wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. He wanted to forgive her, but he didn't know how. "We're hypocrites," he said finally, his voice bitter. "All of us. Me, you, Haley, Zach, everyone who knew and kept quiet. We all pretended everything was okay. For what? For peace of mind? For the kids? For ourselves?" Mary Ann nodded, her tears still falling. "Maybe to keep us together," she said, her voice barely audible. "Maybe because the truth is too hard." He stood up, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out the bottle of whiskey they kept for special occasions. He poured 2 glasses, set one in front of her, and took the other for himself. "Then what are we drinking?" he asked, his voice full of bitterness. "Love? It's dead. Family? It's falling apart." Mary Ann took the glass, her fingers shaking. She looked at him, her eyes full of pain, but there was a spark in them, too not of love, but of something else, something that had held them together all these years. "To the secrets," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "To the secrets that keep us together." He looked at her, his lips twitching in a bitter smile. He raised his glass, and they clinked, their eyes meeting one last time. The whiskey burned their throats, but it didn't warm them. They sat in silence, knowing that the truth they both now knew had changed everything. But in that silence, in that toast, there was not love, but something more complicated, the understanding that their secrets, their mistakes, their pain were what bound them together, even as everything fell apart. Morning came, the sun rose higher, but the kitchen remained cold. Jason and Mary Ann sat in silence, their glasses empty, their future uncertain. They knew the truth would destroy their family, but they also knew that without these secrets, they might not be able to hold together. And therein lay their difficult choice to live with the truth or the lie that held their family together. If you liked it, tell your friends. If you didn't, come back anyway. I promise to surprise you again. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.